My name is Blake Moore, Natural Resources Extension Agent.
Hey, I'm Dan Severson, Ag Agent.
Hi, I'm Jake Jones, Kent County Ag Agent for the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension. Welcome to Extension 302.
Welcome to Extension 302, where we are keeping Extension real, reliable, and relevant. I am Dan Severson, along with Dr. Jake Jones.
Hey, everyone.
And Mr. Blake Moore.
Hello.
Today, our guest is going to be Dr. Cara Cuite. She was on our show a few episodes ago talking about misinformation. Well, welcome, Dr. Cara.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
Normally, we start with an icebreaker, and your first icebreaker was about scrapple. Today, I brought in pork roll for Jake and Blake. I want to hear what they had to say about it.
So I will say this. I've eaten pork roll before, and I've always enjoyed it. I think it's great, but scrapple is definitely the better one. By far, sorry.
I'd agree. When you have the option, I like pork roll at night and scrapple in the morning.
Dr. Cara, have you tried scrapple yet?
I'm feeling very left out of this entire conversation because I have not. Since we last spoke, I also have not had pork roll. And I think I had it once, maybe. So this is just not my area of expertise by any stretch. But I am, in honor of the forthcoming Scrapple Festival, I'm going to see if I can get some in New Jersey.
Since we're talking about food and packaging and stuff, from what I understand, there's new labels for bioengineered food coming out.
There are new labels coming out. In many cases, they're already out, but the deadline for labeling is January 1st of next year. Back in 2016, Congress passed the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Law. And that basically said that the USDA was going to have to create a standard to determine how and when bioengineered foods have to be labeled. It took quite a few years. In 2018, they released the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Standard, which has a specific guidance of how we're going to implement the law. So ultimately, the deadline is January 1st, 2022. Some of my colleagues and I have been really interested in this because we've been studying what the public thinks and knows about genetically engineered or bioengineered foods. I've been doing it since 2003, and my colleague Bill Hallman's been working on it since the 90s. And it's just something that the public really, with some exceptions, I think there have been small groups of people who've been paying a whole lot of attention to this, but by and large, the public has not been paying attention to this issue and isn't really aware of, how prevalent genetically modified or bioengineered foods are in our diets and whether or not they've already were labeled. So it's really interesting to see, is this law going to, kind of push this issue to the forefront and make people notice it more? Or is the way that we're approaching labeling going to mean that most people are still going to remain unaware of it? And that's really a question that I'm interested in studying once the law is fully implemented in January.
So what does the public think? Or your conclusion was they weren't thinking a whole lot?
Yeah, I mean, we've done surveys over time, and we know, for example, in 2013, we asked a series of questions, as far as are there any foods? And we were calling them genetically modified, not bioengineered. We can talk about that in a second, what the difference is there and why we would call it one over the other. But, we said, so as far as are there any foods containing genetically modified ingredients in supermarkets right now? And over half of the people said they have no idea. They don't know. People just weren't really sure. And then also when we asked, well, do you think genetically modified foods have to be labeled? People, again, they didn't know, or they thought that they did have to be labeled, and they didn't up until this law was passed. And what I like to say is that were people paying a lot of attention? No. Should they be? No. I mean, there were no disclosures on packages. It wasn't something that the average person would have any way of knowing for the most part. Prior to this law, there are some exceptions to that, but it makes sense that people wouldn't generally be paying attention. It's not something that's easy to tell from food labels, or some of the science is very complex. And I will say right now, I like to always say this when I'm talking about this topic, I'm a research psychologist. So some of the science behind the technology, that's not what I'm an expert on. I really study how people think about these things. It's a complicated topic, so it makes a lot of sense that the public wouldn't be super engaged in this.
Whenever we go shopping in the grocery store and we pick up some food and think about what we're looking at on the label. I mean, I've dieted before, so trying to look at the nutrition information, ingredients, where it's sourced from. what do these labels that have this new requirement, what does that mean for me and my family? And how should we be looking at this?
Mostly it means that the food label has changed, but not the food. So we've been eating genetically modified or bioengineered foods since 1994. And let me back up for 1 second to say, so what is a bioengineered or genetically engineered food, right? When I speak about this with the public, I mostly just say, think back to your classes, early science classes that you took in elementary school, middle school, and you learn about selective breeding and crossbreeding, which are techniques that people have been using for millennia, right? That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something very distinct, which is something that happens in a lab. It's not something that happens through nature or could happen through nature. So the technical definition for this new law is that bioengineered food is a food that contains genetic material that has been modified through in vitro rDNA techniques. That is what is considered to be a bioengineered food. So it's not something that can happen in nature the way that we had used selective breeding or crossbreeding in the past. It's something specific. We've been eating foods that have been created using those techniques since 1994 is when they first started being sold in the US. These foods are very prevalent. When people ask me, well, how can I avoid genetically modified foods? I say your best bet is to sort of shop around the outside of the supermarket, the fruit and vegetable aisle, the meats. Those types of foods are much less likely to be genetically modified. It's really processed foods that we're talking about that are all more in the center aisles of the grocery store that are much more likely to contain genetically modified ingredients. So anything that has soy, canola, corn, those are the kinds of foods, and most processed foods have some of those ingredients in them. So those all have genetically modified. So now, and this is where it gets a little technical and a little tricky. They might not be considered bioengineered, but they are what we generally understand to be to come from genetically modified crops, right? Over 90% of the corn, canola, soy, cotton, almost all of that we grow in this country are grown as genetically modified crops. Some of the confusion happens when it goes from its sort of plant form into and gets processed and put in as an ingredient. So say, for example, corn, if you take corn that's grown as a genetically modified crop and you process it, the DNA is no longer present. It's destroyed through the process of processing it and turning it into an oil. For the purposes of the new law, that oil wouldn't be considered a bioengineered food, but it is something that was grown as a genetically engineered or genetically modified crop.
Who came up with the GMO labeling way back in like 94?
Okay, so in 94, we had our first GMO food hit the market, and that was the Flavor Savor tomato, which is not on the market anymore. But it wasn't labeled as genetically modified. There was no labeling required. Over time, as we saw more and more genetically modified foods hit the shelves, we also saw the creation of these third-party labels that were labeling the absence of genetically modified ingredients, right? There's something called the Non-GMO Project, where a company could pay this third-party labeling company to say, okay, they've come out to our fields, they've checked everything that we've done, and they are ensuring that we do not have genetically modified ingredients. That's what we've seen, but we haven't seen very much positive labeling where people say, yes, this does include genetically modified ingredients or bioengineered ingredients, right? That really hasn't been there. All right, so, and I'm going to stop, and I almost feel like maybe I should have said earlier on. So the new law is called the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Law, and they have really specific rules about what's considered bioengineered. But since 1994, when the first foods hit the market, the public has been referring to much of this technology as genetic modification and the products as genetically modified foods or genetically modified organisms. And the short acronym for genetically modified organisms is what most of us know this as, which is a GMO. As far as this new law, there are some differences between what we would consider a GMO and a bioengineered food, but we know that the public thinks about this technology with the terms genetically modified or GMOs. And we've done research, survey research on this, even as recently as 2018, as this law was being, or the standards, the new standards were being devised and put in place. We did a survey and we asked people, what is the wording that should be on the labels? And over half said they thought the label should say GMO or genetically modified, and only 12.6 thought that bioengineering was the right wording to use. But the way the law is set up, we're moving forward with bioengineered as the term that we're using, both for the label and for the what gets counted and not counted. So it correlates, although not 100%, with what the public thinks of as a GMO.
Have you guys done any research to determine if either one of those words are viewed in a more negative light?
Many years ago, we did some research. We didn't use the word bioengineered, but we used the word agricultural biotechnology. We know that the movement against these foods have gotten attention as the anti-GMO movement. GMO is somewhat associated with the non-GMO project, the anti-GMO food movement. So it's possible that some, and I don't know that this is true or not true, but it's possible that some of the people creating the law saw that as a term that they wanted to move away from and move toward the more kind of technical term of bioengineered. It's also just more specific, easier to designate which foods should be considered bioengineered for the law. And GMO is really more a broader, more umbrella term. And it is one more, definitely more used by the public. And like I said, we did ask specific to this law back in 2018 when we did a survey, what do you think should be on the label? And most people said it should be GMO or genetically modified. And very few people thought that bioengineered food was the right term to have on the label.
So we've talked about the law a lot. Can you give us a little bit more reasoning as to why the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Law was passed?
Part of what was happening is that individual states were trying to figure out how they could label bioengineered or genetically modified, and another term that's often used is genetically engineered foods in their states. There were two different things that were happening. Some states were having statewide referenda, which just mean that the citizens of those states could vote on whether or not to label genetically engineered, genetically modified, bioengineered foods. That happened in 4 states. We saw them in California, in Washington, and then in 2014, we saw 2 states have referenda, Oregon and Colorado. These were, all 4 were defeated and really super amazingly close in these elections, with the exception of Colorado, where it was defeated pretty soundly. But the other 3 states, it was really, really close. Lawmakers were watching that, knowing that perhaps we would have ended up with a state that ended up with labeling through a referendum. At the same time, other states were moving through with legislative action. So it didn't require a vote by the citizens of the state, but the legislative bodies were passing laws to label GMO foods. So we saw that in Connecticut, we saw that in Maine, and then finally in Vermont. Connecticut and Maine passed laws. They're both relatively small states. They said, well, when enough other states near us pass similar laws, then our law will go into effect. So they were kind of sitting there waiting, because it is really hard for the food industry to have a different label that's required in Connecticut that's not required, say, in New York or Massachusetts, right? It gets really tricky. So they were saying, let's wait until enough states in our general area require this, then our law will go into effect. Vermont said, we're not waiting, we're just doing this. We're putting this law into effect. It's going to happen. And that was in the summer of 2016. And basically, as soon as that law was going into effect is when we ended up with the national law. And the national law, part of the rationale that was put forth is because they were saying that the food industry really would have, and the USDA and all the regulatory bodies would have a really hard time dealing with different labels in different states, we'd end up with a patchwork quilt. So rather than have that patchwork quilt start popping up around the country, we're going to come in with a national law.
I remember Vermont playing a role. I'm glad you explained that.
What's actually going to be on these new labels? What's required to be on these labels, and how are the companies going to get that done?
That is a good question. And there are 4 different approaches that a company can take with these labels. And I should say that there are some exclusions. Really small companies don't need to do it. There's a threshold in terms of sales and stuff like that. But for the foods that have to have a label, there are 4 options. One is just text on the packaging that says bioengineered. One option is a QR code, those weird square things that you can point your cell phone camera at and it will take you to a web page. And I can tell you that people were not super happy with a QR code as the label because that requires an extra step, right?
Yeah, Blake was just saying the QR code seems like a easy out.
It's an out, like, because then you're putting the onus on the or the responsibility on the consumer, and we're all consumers. We know how often we actually do that type of thing while we're in the grocery store shopping.
Right. I was going to say, yeah, how often do you whip out your phone and start looking up the different foods that you're buying? So a lot of people were very unhappy with the QR code option because it does put the onus, like you said, on the consumer. And some consumers don't have smartphones, or don't know how to work a QR code or whatever. So not only does it put the onus on the consumers, but not all consumers can even do what would be required to find out about the food. There's some anti-GMO groups that had some ads that they were doing where they had like a QR code equals, and then they had like that poison sign, so to say like, if you see a QR code on your food, you should know that that probably means that it's got some kind of bioengineered ingredients and you should avoid it, sort of things. So maybe as we move forward with this, it's possible that we'll see QR codes being sort of a proxy for bioengineered foods. People might see that as a proxy. But yeah, definitely people felt like that was not disclosure in the sense that it's actually disclosing meaningful information to the public in a way that they can easily access it. So that was controversial.
Yeah, I've actually been to grocery stores where you don't even get service either. So then you can't even look it up anyway. I mean, were you going to buy it and then you're going to come back? I got to return this food because I didn't know at the time, but it's or bioengineered.
There's a lot of reasons why people are unhappy. But then my question to you is, how many people do you think when they get home and get service are going to look it up and return the food?
0 to none.
What are the things that people use to make decisions about what they're buying? And for some people, I think what our research has found over the years of repeated surveys is that for some people, this is a super important issue, and they really and truly are eating in a way that, trying to find food and eat in a way that lets them avoid these types of foods. And for other people, it's really more about calories or nutrition or, whatever it is, people are using different decision points. And some people aren't using any of those, people are using different types of information. And some people are not using any information on the labels, right? And there's a lot. I was just talking with some students a couple of weeks ago about date labeling and, how people make decisions around date labeling and how do you make sense of that? And, what's the difference between best by or used by? There's so much information in any food label that someone might pick up that I think that for some people, they just don't look at any of it. It's just easier to just say, oh, I like this and I'm going to eat it. There are 2 more ways of disclosure. You can also have a text message disclosure where you can text a number and they'll tell you the information. Yeah, like again, it's right there with the QR code. And then the third one is the one that I was super interested in. And again, my colleague Bill Hallman and I did some research on this, where they have an actual logo that they'll put on food. They have 2 logos that they came up with. One that in the final version, one says bioengineered and the other one says derived from bioengineering. So the derived from bioengineering is an optional label. And that gets at sort of what I was talking about before, like how corn oil doesn't necessarily have the DNA in it. So it doesn't bioengineered DNA. So it doesn't count as a bioengineered food, but it was derived from a bioengineered food, right? So that's kind of the difference there. So bioengineered is like a very specific technique where they're actually changing the DNA. We did a study of these symbols and what people thought of them. And originally, the USDA had released 3 prototype labels or 3 prototype designs. Some of the designs that they originally had just had BE and didn't have the word bioengineered, and people really did not know what those meant. If you have a symbol that just says BE, some people were telling us, we said, what do you think that means? If you saw this on a food label, what would your best guess be that this means? And a lot of people said they could not guess at all. And then we heard guesses like be happy, be hungry, whatever. They thought it just meant the word be. Other people said, well, maybe it means Britain, England, or, like all kinds of crazy guesses. Almost no one guessed bioengineered. So we were really happy when the final symbols were released and that they all said bioengineered. So they're not doing that, just that acronym anymore, which was a real relief. And when we had them look at an example in our study that looks a lot like the final one, it's not exactly the same as the final one. We still found that almost a quarter of respondents did not know even when it says bioengineered, they're like, I have no idea what that means. I can't even make a guess as to what this is telling me about the food. And then almost 3/4 said that they thought it meant something about that the food was grown in a lab or not natural or something kind of sciencey or lab based. Although some people were able to guess the food was genetically modified or something, but a lot of them just got a more kind of general sense that it was something to do with labs and science.
We saw the disclosure stickers. They look very nice to me.
All of the prototypes that they had originally come up with were all very appealing and happy. The colors are nice. It does indicate a field, agriculture to some extent. They were going for something. I think the fear for a lot of the food companies was that these labels would be seen as a warning, right?
Yeah, this isn't the skull and crossbones kind of label.
Exactly. So I think that they really tried very hard to make sure that whatever symbol they put on there is not seen as a warning. It's not the skull and crossbones. It's not saying avoid this. A lot of people said, it means it's natural. It means it was grown with the sun or whatever, very positive. It does definitely give off a very positive vibe, which I think probably, again, I was not in the rooms where they were deciding what the label should look like. I don't know this for a fact, but my guess is that they were trying to make the sort of anti-warning label, an appealing label that wouldn't be off-putting for anyone. Some of the disclosures, a lot of people object to because they think, okay, it's not really telling me information. If I don't have a phone, if I don't have access to the internet, if I don't have time to search on the QR code, it's not going to tell me anything. Even for these symbols that have, or these, that have the word on there, a lot of people still don't know what it means, right? So there's no one way that we're going to fully inform people of exactly what it means. And that's why one of the recommendations that we have is that there probably needs to be some education that goes on as well. It's not just sticking these symbols or the QR code or whatever, the text on the package, but that there has to be some education that goes hand in hand with
And
that.
I think extension would be a great place for some of that education to take place.
I 100% agree with that. It has to happen across the country, right? This is happening everywhere, and extension is everywhere. And I think that would be absolutely great.
Yeah, and this is good. So I mean, even when the label goes on, the people who are really concerned about that are going to know what it means and they're going to shop accordingly. Whereas most people are not concerned about that; they're going to continue shopping as normal. So it's one of those things, I guess, where if you want to know, you will.
Yeah. And here's the other piece of it. Well, first of all, the people who are already concerned, I did mention non-GMO project and how you could buy foods that were labeled as not genetically modified or bioengineered, but also the organic label is a way that people can shop in a way to ensure that they're not getting any genetically modified or bioengineered food, because that is a requirement of getting the organic label. But I would also say that a lot of people don't know that. So the people who want to know, who are really concerned, that small percentage of the population, whatever it is, 10% or whatever, they can use the organic label as a workaround to avoid, or they had been, they had been able to do this up until this new labeling law. They had been able to use the organic also to avoid the foods. But yeah, I think when you said, the first question, like, what do people need to know? I think the first thing is that they need to know that this is the same food that they've been eating all along. It's just the label that's changed, most likely. I mean, some foods will change, but by and large, the label doesn't mean that there have been a change in ingredients or a process used to create the food. It's just that it's now being labeled. But then the question is, okay, now that it's labeled, what do people make of that label? Do the people who weren't paying attention before, A, do they understand it? And B, is it meaningful to them in any way that will change their purchasing and consumption habits? And that remains to be seen.
It's interesting you bring up the organic label. I came across that chicken wings. If you go to try to find an organically labeled chicken wing, you're probably not going to find that, because the companies know that the people eating wings, they're not buying organic wings. They're not going to pay extra money to have an organic wing because they don't care.
Will people pay attention? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all agree that labels are great and disclosures on them are great. We all just look at them and prioritize them differently.
So we've gone over that products derived from bioengineering can be voluntarily labeled. Are there any other exceptions where bioengineered foods don't have to be labeled?
We have a threshold where it's 5%. There are a bunch of technical details of this law. There's a threshold where it's 5% of, if it has 5% or more of bioengineered ingredients, that it has to be labeled. But if it has less than that, it does not have to be included. This does not have to be disclosed in restaurants or any other retail setting. So that's another exemption.
Gross sales?
Yeah, of the company. Bioengineered additives, like there are certain additives that are considered incidental, don't have to be labeled. Oh, and here it is. So it's bioengineered foods that are sold by small or very small manufacturers, defined as less than 2.5 million in annual sales. That's the exempt. That's the threshold for the sales on the manufacturer side. So there are a few ways that bioengineered foods could come in unlabeled. The big one that I think is really interesting and is controversial for some people is the whole idea that if the DNA isn't present, that then it doesn't count as bioengineered. So it can be a food that was grown 100% as a bioengineered crop or a genetically modified crop. And if it's processed to the point that the DNA isn't there, it's not considered bioengineered. And I think that for some people, that feels like a violation of the spirit of labeling of these foods, right? That they want to know, actually, does it come from a plant that was bioengineered? And that is not in this at all. That's just not required to be disclosed.
And this is for all food sold in the US, even if it comes from another country, has to be labeled?
Yeah,
Or
importers have to label too. Yep. So, and then one other thing I guess I would say that they point out as an exception, and it's interesting because I've had people ask me about this, is, well, what if an animal was fed bioengineered feed? They got bioengineered corn or soy. Should that be considered bioengineered? And the law is very clear that that does not count at all. It's only animals whose own DNA has been altered. So the only food that's on the market where that's the case is the Aqua Advantage salmon that just recently came to market, where that does have bioengineered DNA present in the salmon itself. But I had a woman, when I was talking about this many years ago, talking about how if a chicken is fed GMO corn, it should be considered a GMO chicken. And I said, well, have you ever eaten processed food? And she said, yes. I said, well, you've probably eaten genetically modified food. Does that make you a GMO? And she said, of course not. And I said, well, that's really the same logic that you're applying for the chicken, right? So that's, that's something where I think people can be a little bit confused about, but the law is super clear that the DNA has to be present, and just feeding an animal bioengineered feed does not turn them into GMO or bioengineered organism at all. It gets tricky. And I think the conversation that we were just having, that people don't look, there's a lot of information that various people think should be on there, but is the general public using that in their decision-making? And
I'm going to say I don't. I look at the weight and the cost per pound. I don't.
Right.
I mean, if I'm going to buy beef or chicken, I'm hoping it's beef and chicken. So I trust that. And I look, how much does it cost? How much does it weigh?
Well, that's another thing in my Wegmans is the greatest grocery store in the world. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but it is. It's my favorite. And they started selling a couple of years ago irradiated hamburgers and cheeseburgers, which I was somewhat amazed by because it said very clearly on there, irradiated meat. But it was kind of exciting to me because I love rare burgers, but I don't eat them anymore because of food safety issues. So
Right.
I never actually bought them and I don't see them anymore. So I guess they weren't super popular. But, that's another case where the trade-off is, wait, are you worried about the irradiation or are you worried about microorganisms? And depending on what you're concerned about, you might buy that food. So it's really a lot of trade-offs that we're making. So it gets to, we have this very specific definition in this law of bioengineered. And, even talking about it with you all today, it's a little bit of a struggle because I'm so used to, and I know the public's used to saying genetically modified or GMO, but bioengineered is the very specific word that we're talking about here with this law. A lot of the companies said that they've already started doing these labels, and some of them actually were labeling even before this law was passed. Most of them were using genetically engineered as the wording on their food, like Kellogg's and Campbell's, and a couple of big companies kind of saw the writing on the wall and started proactively labeling their foods. But I haven't personally seen these new symbols on any foods yet. January 1 is the deadline. We'll see if all of a sudden we start seeing a lot of these foods popping up. Where on the label is the disclosure? The law isn't, they allow it to appear in different spots on the label. So it can be part of the information panel that's next to the name and location of the distributor, which is usually below the nutrition facts panel. And then they also have some rules about if there's not enough space, it can be put somewhere else. Because you can imagine there's some really small foods that are going to struggle to have a lot of information on there. So it depends. There's no one spot that you'll see it on the food. I'm really curious, are people going to start paying attention to this? Or is it just going to be another piece of information that's just on the labels? Or if it turns out to be all QR codes, is that even going to have an impact? I don't know if they'll do any release of how many people actually use the QR codes, because that would be something that would be interesting. Some people say they will use them, but people also say that they always look at their food labels, and when you look at videos of people shopping in grocery stores, the rates of people looking at the food labels are lower than people will self-report. It'll be really interesting to see once this rolls out officially on January 1, if things are any different and if people are any more aware of bioengineered foods and paying any more attention to that as an issue in their decision making. The highlight for me right now is that when we provided this information about just like the text bioengineered or these symbols to people in our survey research, a lot of people struggle to understand what it means. So I'm really interested to see, once it's out there in the real world, I want to do some more surveys. I want to get back out in the field and ask people, have you seen this? Have you seen a QR code? Did you click on it? To try to really understand, how are people interacting with these in the real world, and are they using them? And if not, why not? And then to look at, like we were talking about, doing some of the educational work and trying to help people to understand them, and how can we explain them and kind of help bring the public up to speed for those people who aren't. Because again, there are people who have been paying a lot of attention to this and know about it, but for the majority of people who haven't been, how can we bring them up to speed to let them know what these symbols and these various terms mean? And that's something that I'm excited to do some work on.
We hope you've enjoyed today's episode and will join us next time. In the meantime, visit us online at udel.edu/extension, join our mailing list, and join us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at UD Extension. This program is brought to you by the University of Delaware Cooperative Extension, a service of the UD College of Agriculture and Natural Resources, a land-grant institution. This institution is an equal opportunity provider.